Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, a PhD student in Russian Lit.
And I'm Cameron Lalana.
This is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. This week, we are really excited to be joined by José Vergara. José is an assistant professor of Russian on the Myra T. Cooley Lectureship at Bryn Mawr College's Department of Russian. His first book, which he will be talking about a little bit today, All Future Plunges to the Past, James Joyce in Russian Literature, was released in October 2021 through the Northern Illinois University Press, imprint of Cornell University Press. A lot of presses. The book explores how Russian writers from the mid-1920s to the present day have read literally and figuratively Joyce's fiction, and how they then creatively responded to it. José, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. So we got two things to talk about. We have Envy by Yuri Olesha, and then we have your book, which talks about Joyce and Olesha and Joyce and a lot of things, actually. So it's going to be a good talk.
Because we've got Dr. Vergara here, we'll push off our usual spiel about Patreon off to the end of the episode, but we did want to extend a quick thank you to our most recent patron, Maya. But before we get into the reading, Matt, José, what are you both drinking today?
So I wanted to, given the subject matter today with Joyce, I wanted to have some Jameson on hand, but it just didn't work out that way. So instead, I am representing Philadelphia with some Yards Loyal Lager. I don't know. It's a beer.
Fair enough.
It's pretty good, but it's Philly based, and depending on how things go, I also had a little tequila on hand. So
love that.
We'll see what happens.
That is the perfect combination. But thank you.
I'm glad that my cursory Google search, and by Google search, I typed what was Joyce's favorite drink into Google, and I did the first one, and I saw Jameson, and I was like, bang! So I put some Jameson in my decaf coffee.
Perfect.
And it's going to be a show. So I'm glad that was confirmed by an expert.
Yeah, unfortunately, I just didn't manage to pick some up in time, but
it's all right. You've got good backups. What do you have, Cameron?
So I have, and I will not lie because I've been roasted by my father about my alcohol choices in the last couple of episodes. He says they're too pedestrian, so I went out to finally get a craft beer. So I have here by Dust Bowl Brewing Company, which last came on with I think it was a porter or a stout, Taco Truck Lager. Okay. Which because it's not summer yet, but it's already like 95 degrees out here because I live in hell. So I thought a lager might cool me down, and also Central Valley is known for its food trucks, so representing the hottest part of California. It's probably not the hottest part, but I don't care about Southern California. Anyway,
it looks fun.
It is fun. I'm ready to. It's extremely hot, as I mentioned, so I'm ready to probably keep drinking these until I'm cool. So we're gonna see how that turns out for the episode. So I'm glad we're all really primed for getting a little smashed by the end of this.
I'm curious how you said your father, right? Your dad, he roasted you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How did he roast you?
He said, Cameron, I'm a little disappointed in your drink choices. It's been liquor and all these other uninteresting drinks. I thought I raised you better to have more interesting beer.
Well, it seems perfect given envy and father-son conflict. So you predicted this.
You're right. This is the perfect book for that.
Yeah.
I'll have to recommend it to him on this basis. I was just recommending him fathers and children, so this will be a good follow-up to that.
Yeah, how to roast your children. Yeah.
In a way, it's about fathers and children. In a way. Do we want to get into this?
Let's talk about it.
Start us with a summary, Cameron?
Yeah, absolutely. So this summary is going to be a little disjointed because this book is, I feel like this is just the Soviet literature we've been reading, but so many Soviet lit books are about early Soviet lit are about like the main character kind of wandering through the new society. This feels like the basic plot line of Cement and Vasilisa Maligina, and but good and very interesting. Having a lot of thoughts along the way. So we open the book with our main character Nikolai Kovalarov waking up and listening to his, we might understand to this point, kind of his housemate Andrei Babachev waking up, who is just loud. He's walking down the hallways, he's singing to himself, he's farting, burping, making all kinds of noises. He's peeing, singing to himself about his bowel movements while he's peeing, which is what you do love to have in your housemates. Kovalarov is like trying to like hide under the covers and not exist, whereas Babachev is just taking up all the space. Opposite Babachev's just embrace of life, Kavalerov is noting things like things don't like him, even down to furniture. His relationship to the inanimate objects around him is quite complicated, and this is in sharp contrast to Babachev, who is like we mentioned, full of joie de vivre, walking around. He's the director of the food industry trust, and he is like the ideal new Soviet man in a way that he's like always working, running this department, trying to bring about a new, basically a dining room in Chetverter quarter, which is going to replace, or hopefully will replace, the individual kitchen. So instead of having, Babachev says this will be a great revolution for the women, who instead of having to spend half a day making cabbage soup, can instead, like, everyone can come here and get their food. And he wants to see this complete industrialization of kitchens to make this easier. And he wants all these materials. It's going to be great. And I don't remember if this is mentioned at this point or this is a little bit later, but one of the big things about this is the 37 kopeck sausage that he wants to bring. And it's going to be super nutritious and healthy. And it's got to be 37 kopecks or thereabouts.
Don't give me 38 kopeck sausage. I will not buy it. I won't stand for it.
Cavallero or Babachev was trying to pioneer the Costco sausage or hot dog, and so Babachev always busy, always on the go. He's running about, and Kavalerov is like kind of uncomfortable because it's not his home. He's staying, as you might understand, this is Babachev's home, not Kavalerov's. And so for most of the day, Kavalerov is kind of left to his own devices. And in the evenings, Babachev has him kind of doing copying work or other like assorted administrative work. Kavalerov is like, he listens to Babachev in the evenings talk to himself. He is just pissed off, and he's always like on the verge of insulting him, but never quite gets there, although he has vivid fantasies about going off on him. He's kind of like an errand boy for Babachev in a lot of ways, up to and including like when they're trying to communicate the sausage, he gets sent out later in the book to go out and to take this very important 37 kopeck sausage to all the other members who it's important to bring in. And as he's sitting here in these evenings, Kavalerov feels like Babachev is kind of a, how do I say this? Not erudite like Kavalerov. He's like too Soviet man. He's very focused in industry, does not know that much about art. And Kavalerov is like almost wants to like show off how well read and how knowledgeable he is, but never quite managed to take himself to that degree. And we find out at this point that Kavalerov is living in Babachev's home because he got too drunk at a bar, tried to hit on a woman, and then everyone made fun of him for his approach. And then he decided to go off in the whole bar, which got him kicked out. And Babachev, in a moment of kindness, when he's going home from the office, found him, picked him up, and brought him back, and is kind of getting him back on his feet. In a lot of ways, Kavalerov begins to think maybe he's kind of a replacement for a young man whose pictures are around this apartment, who we later find out is Volodya Makarov, who is a young man who basically Babachev raised from childhood to adulthood, who's now gone off to be a first-class football player. And during these meditations, at one point, a man shows up to yell at Babachev about a machine called Ophelia, who we find out is Babachev's brother, Ivan. Babachev is not fond of Ivan and sends him away. You further learn more about Kavalerov's life. Previously, he was staying in the house of a woman named Anichka Prokopovich, and it wasn't going great. He didn't have a lot of money. He was just kind of making it by. And his Kavalerov is like, we're getting worried about his age. He's at the incredibly ancient age of 27, and is just all the time thinking about, man, I'm becoming more like my father. I knew not physically looking like my father, but just some feature, some characteristic of like getting old I've taken on, and he doesn't love that. He thinks on all of his dreams when he was younger, again, because he's washed up in 27, and totally cannot do anything at this point in his life, and thinks back on how much he wanted to be someone of a figure of great renown when he was young, and recalls being at a wax museum and imagines people remembering him, not necessarily fondly, maybe remembering his great extremes of emotion. As we follow through, he's just kind of going about his days. At one point, he is just walking down the street and happens to see Ivan again, who calls up to a window, and a young girl, whose name we find out is Valya, comes out to it, and they have an exchange. Ivan runs off, and Kavalerov kind of starts to develop kind of an obsession with this girl. She's like 16, so yeah, there's that. So at this point, like I mentioned earlier, we come around to the prototype salam, or the prototype sausage, which Babachev has been trying to get this. If it's not 37 kopecks, I'm going to really look like a fool. So I can actually agree. Was it 37 kopecks, or am I misremembering that? I should have written that down.
I think it might be 35, but it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe
That's
so.
the power of
Yeah.
editing.
Okay, 35 kopecks. All right. Well, there's egg in my face now. So Kavalerov spends the whole day running around taking this sausage to, other party members, especially one who is like, "You son of a bitch, Babachev, you did it." And it's so exciting that Babachev is like, "No, bring the sausage back. Tonight we're going to drink vodka at my place and eat the sausage." And on his way back, Kavalerov is like really considering throwing it into the river, but he can't bring himself to, although he quite imagines it. In the next couple of days, many things happen to Babachev. They go out to airfields and all the, Babachev is just, he's being heralded for all the stuff he's doing, but Kavalerov at the same time, despite being kind of his unofficial clerk, is having a hard time even just getting to events because he doesn't have invitations. He's just there and he's trying to convince people like, "No, I'm supposed to be here, guys." And he's pissed off about this, and he decides that he's gonna cut his ties, and he writes a letter to Babachev, basically saying that I'm done with you. You're stupid. Also, you're trying to sleep with your niece. It's, in essence, not exactly. A lot to say there. He is about to leave when suddenly someone else enters, and this is, as we mentioned before, Volodya Makarov, who's now coming back to see Babachev, and they have an argument. It's pretty obvious that Volodya sees Kavalerov as kind of like a hang-on. Kavalerov grabs his letter and runs out and is like, he flees. And when he goes outside, he realizes that he's not in fact taken his own letter, but in fact he has taken Volodya's letter to Babachev about their relationship and coming back home and having to see him, and then also dunking on Kavalerov. And we also we find out that Volodya and Valya actually have unlike Kavalerov's imagined relationship with Ivan's daughter Valya and Volodya apparently do have an actual relationship, which is not exactly romantic, but seems to be trending that way in a sense. They plan to kiss for the first time once the quarter, the industrial kitchen that Babachev is trying to open finally is open to the public. Kavalerov returns to the apartment and finds Babachev there now. And before anything even happens, he just tells him to get out, essentially. Kavalerov goes off on Babachev and Volodya, and for all his troubles, gets punched and is forced to leave and thinks, "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill Comrade Babachev." And as he's going through the reigning city at that point, Kavalerov is kind of lost and comes across a small man in a bowler hat who, I probably should have mentioned, each time Ivan shows up, it's noted that he's wearing a bowler hat, not quite fitting for his age. And they kind of fall into a conversation, and he asks him, what is this Ophelia you mentioned when you were not exactly yelling at Babachev, because Kavalerov doesn't reveal that he was living with him, but he begins to begins to chat with him. This is where we enter part 2 of the book, which is where we actually jump more into focusing on the Babachev brothers. Actually, there were 3 of them, but the eldest, Roman, joined a revolutionary organization and was executed for what he was doing with that org. So Andrei is the youngest, Ivan's the middle, and Ivan has always been quite a dreamer. Their father, who was a classicist and a school administrator of some sort, has always got down on Ivan for his dreams and punished him for not knowing things like exact details about specific Roman battles, which are the really important things about life. His whole childhood is basically him not quite being enough, with the maybe possible exception of the time when he helped a student get revenge on an aunt who prevented that student from seeing her niece by, as he says, making a flower grow out of a wart in her face. So he's got quite a fantastical imagination. And he grows up and supposedly goes to the Petersburg Polytechnical Institute and becomes, even though he has this education, or at least he says he does, mostly begins to take on a persona of essentially being kind of like a public speaker of a sort, bringing people together, bringing people who are not happy with what's going on together and preaching to them. And he gets often thrown about for this, and he becomes kind of a not popular, especially Babachev at this point, who's now kind of rising, is not super happy that this is what his brother's doing, especially since a lot of it is speaking out against the new Soviet society. And Ivan grows even more bitter and vows to destroy his brother with a great invention, with Ophelia, which is what we've been mentioning this whole or I've been mentioning so far. This continues for a while, even up till like it gets to an extreme of Ivan even at one point seeing Babachev driving down the street, and he like pulls open the window and tries to jump in the car, and is like, why am I walking around the city when you're, in this, when you get to drive me around. And Babachev is so tired that he actually I don't know if he has him arrested then. I think he actually does. I think he has Ivan arrested a couple times, including at that point, and has him committed. And we kind of at this point are joining Kavalerov and Ivan talking, and Ivan tells a story from his youth when he was as he says, quite a loved youth, up until there was this another girl around the same age when he was a schoolboy who was just as loved as he was, and he became so envious and resentful with her that on the night of a great event, he just beat the absolute shit out of her, tore up her dress, pulled out her hair, and then remarkably somehow he got in trouble for that, which he expresses some shock at, and was kicked out. And he mentions that even though he was kind of dishonored by it, he always had the satisfaction of knowing that he had ruined the party, and he was remembered, not for a good thing, but he was being remembered. And they talk about their mutual enemies. And Ivan does not know that Kavalerov wants to kill his brother Babachev, but Ivan is like, go for it, do it, kill your enemy. We'll rise up together, essentially. Conversely, with Ivan and Kavalerov having their plotting, we go to, on the other hand, Babachev at the same time is happy that Volodya is home and thinking about their new society and like what relationships will be in the future, kind of saying, do I look at Volodya as a son, or am I looking at him as kind of like the new person? Do I love him as a son, or do I love him as what I want our society to become? And thinks a lot about that, and maybe we can talk more about that later. But while they're having these thoughts about the new society, Kavalerov and Ivan are just going all over the place. Kavalerov has gone back to his old landlord, who is now, he's paying 30 rubles a month to basically sleep in a corner of her room. Not doing super hot. Ivan tries to take Kavalerov to go see his machine, Ophelia, but on their way, he's describing to him like, I wanted to build a perfect machine that can do anything, and it's sort of like a golem, essentially. And then I corrupted it by giving it human emotions and human failings, and this will be my revenge upon the world. And as they're walking, they both get almost scared off from where they're going by a young boy whistling, and both feel, as you might understand, a great deal of shame after that. As they're kind of standing here, Kavalerov suddenly realizes like, he's like, maybe this machine isn't actually real, now that I think about it. But Ivan is terrified of it. And after the whistling says like, she hates me. She's going to kill me, this machine. And at that point, Ivan tells Kavalerov a fictional tale where Babachev, again, is giving a speech in front of his industrial kitchen in the quarter. And he's talking about the future, where Ivan shows up holding a pillow and denounces Babachev and says that you're trying to destroy private lives, and I won't let that happen. Everyone should have the right to sleep on their own pillow, and also I'm going to smother my enemies with this pillow. The power of a symbol, and summons up a shadowy figure, Ophelia, to crush down the quarter, and like Samson pushing down the old temple, brings it down the heads of the people in there. And Andrei, who is dying after having the quarter fall on him, asks Ivan's permission to lay his head on the pillow to die. At the same time, Kavalerov is like, I'm finally gonna do the soccer game tomorrow. If Volodya's playing, I'm gonna kill Babachev. And he goes and he's watching. He sees Valya there, and Babachev is there watching. Babachev is like watching the field with binoculars, and it's going great, essentially. Long story short, Volodya does great. Valya is focused on, as well as Babachev, focused on Volodya's playing, and both Ivan and Kavalerov are like, their plans slowly fall apart. Ivan says this conspiracy that he wanted to put together to overthrow society of this modern one has fallen short, and it's failed. Things aren't going, basically give up. Kavalerov goes back home and just like returns to the corner of his landlord's bed and hits her, and then falls asleep, and in his dream imagines like the Ophelia machine coming for him, and spends the next couple of days delirious, and in that deliriousness kind of realizes how the extent of how like far he's kind of fallen, in the sense that he's essentially at the Rubicon of, do I keep being like who I am, or do I leave it behind and start to become someone else? I'd spend another night in the street drinking, and then finally returns back to his landlord's apartment, where he finds Ivan in her bed, and says he's drinking wine, and Kavalerov asks him, what does this mean? And Ivan says, it means nothing. Let's drink, Cavallero. We talked a lot about this, and we forgot the main one, my friend. We forgot indifference, didn't we? In fact, I think that indifference is the best of all conditions of the human mind. Let's be indifferent, Cavallero. Let's drink to indifference. And then he tries to trim by saying, hey, good news, Cavallero. Today it's your turn to sleep with Anichka. Hurrah. Which is where we end this very, very interesting set of character relationships.
You said it was going to be kind of disjointed, and maybe it was. but the novel is so strange in that way, right? There's all these events happening in sequence and sometimes parallel, and at least one kind of loop where we go back and see what actually happened with the arrest and everything. Yeah, it's just, this string of small events and dreams and imagination imaginary wanderings and all sorts of things. I don't know. It was such a beautifully strange book to me still.
It's so weird.
It's so interesting. I love I actually read it after in your book. The first chapter focuses on Yuri Olesha's relationship to James. Excuse me, I was about to say James Cameron. James Joyce. James Joyce, especially in kind of like the sort of relationship between his book Ulysses and Envy. And that was really interesting because it kind of characterized a lot of how I was going through. And I was wondering, actually, could you elaborate for anyone who may not have read your book, talk through some of the main points of your first chapter and kind of the relationship of these two works?
Sure. Well, I'll skip the summary of Ulysses because that would take far too long. But, so we'll rely
do another episode.
We'll rely on your summary of Envy and just kind of hit on some of the similarities. Maybe I guess what I would say is that this spark of inspiration, I suppose, for my book, looking at Russian literature's response to James Joyce or responses to James Joyce, was really Envy. I was rereading Ulysses in a seminar in grad school on Joyce and Beckett and modernity, and it just struck me that there are these certain situations, certain character traits, behaviors, actions that reminded me a lot of Envy. So, for instance, Ulysses begins with this toilet scene. One of the characters is kind of bathing and taking care of his body in a similar way, and this is kind of chanting, singing that he's doing. Very playful and very energetic in the same way Babachev is. And then later, in the fourth chapter of Ulysses, another character goes to the outhouse and does what one does in the outhouse. And so there's this obvious connections. There were to me anyway. And then from there, it's just looking into it, I realized that no one else had done this kind of systematic, long view sort of study of Russian literature's response to Joyce. And specifically with Olesha, what I learned in, reading what he had said about Joyce and looking at these parallels and these kind of intertextual connections between the two works, I was struck by how Olesha was engaging with similar ideas as Joyce about paternity, about relationships between fathers and specifically sons, but children, generational differences in general, and kind of working through his own anxieties about growing older, about not being able to be the kind of artist or be the kind of individual that he wanted to be, much like Cavallero in his novel. And those are key themes in Ulysses as well. The biggest difference is, as I think is clear from your summary of Envy, Olesha's novel ends quite pessimistically. There's a hurrah at the end, but it's very ironic and this, I don't know, really degraded state for Cavallero. Whereas I think Ulysses is ultimately much more positive or optimistic in the celebration of life and the possibility of an artist. In that case, Joyce's stand-in, Stephen Dedalus, kind of going on his own way and making space for himself in the world.
So your first chapter is on Olesha and Envy, but then there's more chapters. So can you talk about why specifically these authors? Is it just something that you saw while reading? Are there other debates in the literary scene at this time, or kind of continuing through this time that you saw that were particularly interesting? I'm just kind of curious why these specific couple that you chose. Yep.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Ulysses was first translated partly. It was just bits of certain chapters, certain episodes from Ulysses to start in 1925, so a couple of years before Olesha wrote Envy, and all sorts of debates started pretty much immediately. People were reading and discussing him. Either in the original, he was still able to, or his books were still able to come to the Soviet Union at this time pretty easily, more or less. There were all sorts of debates in the late 20s and especially in the 30s as socialist realism, of which I know you both are huge fans. The debates about what art should be in the Soviet Union were happening, and Joyce was kind of, I don't know, a fulcrum, a point, a key figure in these debates about whether Soviet artists should write and create art that's experimental or not. Should it follow what ultimately became the socialist realist model? So all these debates were certainly happening at the time, and other writers were responding to and incorporating Joyce into their own works in different ways and engaging with him in their art as well as with one another. But the other five main authors that I look at are Vladimir Nabokov, probably the most famous among the five, Andrei Bitov, Sasha Sokolov, and Mikhail Shishkin. And one of the reasons I chose them is that I wanted to look at the full extent of Joyce's influence or Joyce's place in Russian literature. So going from the 1920s through the present day, essentially, to see what Joyce was in these various moments and not, provide a picture of a single Joyce, but of various Joyces that these Russian writers were creating for themselves and for Russian literature. And then along with that, I was interested not in a particular moment in the Joycean reception, but in the shifting influence and how these different circumstances, whether Nabokov as an emigre or post-Stalinist writers like Bitov and Sokolov, what they would pull from Joyce as opposed to someone else. You can kind of compare them between them as well.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of following on that trend of like how they saw him over time. This is an interesting thing for Olesha specifically, because as you mentioned, and I think also in your book, that at a later, despite having, as you noted, being a translator of Joyce, I think privately you mentioned, publicly denounced Joyce at a later writers' conference, called them a formalist, and took an example of, isn't it sad, from Ulysses as well, saying a man who looks at cheese as sad because it represents the end of milk. That's not the type of writer that I would like.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he from what I've seen, he admired Joyce and certainly respected him, and it could be ironic and sort of coy about this sort of stuff, certainly in the 30s. And maybe this is what you were alluding to. There was a Russian Joycean scholar who, for some reason, suggested that Olesha may have even translated Ulysses, though he doesn't seem to have spoken English, so I don't know why she would claim that. But yeah, definitely was engaging in these debates. And then, this meeting of Soviet writers publicly and quite stridently denounced Joyce and takes this line about milk or cheese being dead milk. From Ulysses, kind of paraphrasing, misquoting him, but somehow, acknowledging the kind of brilliance of Joyce's metaphors and Joyce's imagery, which is all of the Esha as well. There's all these images and, dazzling metaphors and strange visions all throughout Envy. So, I think he recognized himself or recognized his art in Joyce's brand of modernism as well.
Going back to Envy broadly, I wanted to ask you, because I definitely, as I'm going through this, a lot of, at least when I was reading it, a lot of the themes, and maybe these are just the ones that pop up to me, are like the themes of sort of the problem of fathers and children in a broad societal sense of what was, what is, what will be, that kind of problem. And those are the things that came out to me most prominently. But you mentioned that every time you come back to this, the new things jump out at you. And I was kind of wondering if, what are the themes or features, ideas in the novel that stand out to you most as you, I guess, go through it now?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, every time I read it, like you said, there's something that strikes me, and this is kind of diverging maybe from you were noticing, but the sorts of things that I had in mind in my most recent read through are just certain images or certain image clusters that I'm curious about. There's all this flower imagery and milk, going back to the Joycean connection there. There's this focus on liquids, this just these images that I'd be interested in going back to and kind of studying and tracing. And in particular, I can't recall, I don't think this came up in your summary, but Envy is divided into two parts. The first part is narrated in the first person from Cavaliero's point of view, and the second person all of a sudden, without explanation, switches to a third person narrator. And there's some debate. I think, the general consensus is that it's Cavaliero's voice. It's, I don't know, very much the same sort of bitter narration there for the most part. But I'd be, interested in looking at the language used in both sections and kind of comparing and seeing whether these image clusters and kinds of words and descriptions that Cavaliero uses in the first part actually follow through into the second one. Yeah, I don't know what you guys think about the two narrators.
I took them to be the same personally. Maybe I didn't read close enough. Maybe there's support for
I think that's
else.
the general consensus, and I would probably agree as well. But why does it shift?
It's a good question.
I thought it was just, I don't know. My opinion was it was just almost a further estrangement mechanism. The whole book to me was just I was reading it and I was like, okay, I know what's going on, but at the same time, I don't know what's happening. Is what's happening real? Is it a dream? Where am I when this is taking place? It was, the Cameron summary was very good and it made sense as you were going through. But while reading it has a very, at least on me, it had a strange effect to say the least.
Yeah. Well, at least in part because this is something that I think I'm glad I read your chapter first before I went into it, as I didn't, as you note, there's significant portions of the book which aren't real. They're a sense of imagination of something happening and that takes up half a page, and then Cavaliero being like, this is what this is what should have happened, or this is what I would have done if I had more time, or if Babachev was imaginative like me when he ran into those women who were angry at him, this is what he should have done. Which it does get that sense of, as you're kind of jumping around. Even as you're kind of in the part 2 and Yvonne is explaining things, jumping around time frames and being oh wait, we're jumping, but now we're back in real, the flow of the story rather than just reminded of the past. So it does have a deep sense of which if you're not paying attention, you may not immediately notice, but once you're paying attention, you do see how much of this book is disjointed and in a very interesting way.
Yeah, and imagined a lot of it. I think also, what you just pointed out, those moments where Cavaliero says, oh, I would have done it like this, or I should have done this instead. I think it's very relatable in some ways. I don't want to admit that, or I don't want to say that I'm like Cavaliero. There's a lot about him that's gross and inappropriate. And like you said, he hit his landlord and all this stuff. But I don't know, just on a very basic level, when you put it that way, right, or note those sorts of moments that he wishes things could be different, I think that's relatable in a really strong way for me anyway.
I did feel that one. I did. I know I mentioned earlier that one of the things that really kind of stuck out to me was this idea of sort of the to use the old phrase, the fathers and children, because this is something that was really interesting to me. There's a point very early on where Cavaliero is looking in the mirror and he starts to see his father in himself. In himself, and he says it's not I look like my father, and in fact I think he mentions that he really doesn't. It's really more there's a generic similarity between the two, and what he takes that to mean is, by comparing himself to his father, what he says is that basically my life is done. Let me see if I actually did I have it? Yes. As if I call it a generic similarity, as if I'd suddenly felt my father seed in me, in my substantiation, as if someone had said to me, "You're set, finished. That's all there is. Sire, a son," and then goes on to talk about all the things that he's never going to be. And I think that's so interesting that's the end. It's not just you're never going to be great. You're never going to be what you want to be. It ends on have a son, which is so interesting. Recreate yourself. I don't know if that means in an attempt to have your son be more than what you were, or just to forever create this lineage of this is the natural endpoint of once you're done with your life, you have you pass on the world to the next generation. Because this stands in such stark contrast to Babachev, who fervently denies that Volodya is like a son to him, and he says no, I love him because he is the perfect new Soviet man in a sense, even though it's very obvious that by in every way he treats him, even he kind of comes around to saying, well, maybe I do love him like a son, but that's actually okay because of how I look at things. It's this sort of sense of recreation of the self, of this notion of fatherhood is ultimately, even though it's trying, the notion of fatherhood is trying to be destroyed in a sense in Babachev's like conception, it also is so deeply built into it in the recreation of the self as something better in the next generation, rather than the recreation of the self and like Kavalerov's understanding being the dead end of one's own life. I don't know. That was, it kind of stuck out to me in a lot of I don't exactly know. Maybe I've outlined basically all I had to say about it, but
no, I think that's central and certainly in connection to Joyce as well. Not to make everything about Joyce, but
it kind of is.
Right. Yeah, and I would agree with you with the point that for Kavaliarov, that this idea of having a son means the end, right? That's you've created something so big, right? You've created another life that there's no other possibility, and at that point, this idea of passing on your genes and creating someone else who has that potentiality and that possibility within them that you once had, and this is the marker for that coming to an end, and that terrifies him, or this idea, and recognizing his father and himself, which again I think is entirely relatable, right? We all turn into our parents, and it's kind of scary. Sorry, Mom. I think, it just marks this turning point where he doesn't think he can create the kind of art that he wants to. He can't live out his life in by any other means. And that's critical to Joyce, and this idea that these Russian writers saw in Joyce, that if you create lasting art, if you can create art like Hamlet or Ulysses or, Envy, in fact, that you'll be remembered for. You kind of birth yourself, or birth an idea of you that the world will remember you by. But Kavaliarov hasn't produced that and thinks that he won't anymore. He'll just become a nobody, just like his father. And what a bummer that is. It creates this, this dead end, this standstill for him by the end.
Yeah. Which is an interesting one, because it's simultaneously, like, if it ended like a page earlier, I guess it's like has this like really I don't know, cautiously optimistic of, like, he says, this is my choice, essentially, like, can I be something different? And it's like weirdly optimistic, but then immediately following that when he returns home to find Ivan in the bed being like, nothing matters. All right, it's your turn to use the bed tonight. Right. Which is like such a funny contrast, because it's so close to being honestly actually optimistic before it ends on this really, I almost call this like ambivalent note. Or maybe not ambivalent. Maybe it's a criticism of Ivan and his like a rejection of a society. That is, you could read it that way too, but it doesn't really feel that way when you're going into it.
No, and that that's a central point here, right? That initially the response in the Soviet Union to envy was positive generally, right? It seemed to be a critique of these losers, these failures who couldn't, pick themselves up by their bootstraps and become part of the new system and succeed. The Kavaliarov and the Ivan Babachev, not the Andrei Babachevs. But then you stop and think about it a little more, and a few years go by, and you think, well, are the new men, the new women like Valia and Volodya and Andrei Babachev actually portrayed in a very positive light? Yes and no. And by the end, I do think there's this kind of ambivalence here. Absolutely right. And the kind of, I don't know, sad state of affairs here for everyone. And the question is, what do you do with that? And I don't think Olesha knew how to jettison those feelings or find some alternative, and more or less fell silent, or wasn't able to produce the kind of art that he had with envy after this.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering what you thought, what kind of broadly what you thought this work was for Olesha, because it's so complicated, like you're saying, because it to me, every time I've read it, it's not necessarily clear. There's multiple ways you can interpret the novel, which is why I think it's fun. Olesha, from what I've read at least, or from some of the speeches that I've read him giving, it seems like he wants to be a communist, but not like that kind of communist, kind of is what I get from like all of his speeches. Like he wants like a communism with beauty, so a communism with feelings almost. And it's very interesting, kind of like you were saying, how he doesn't quite fit into where it started to go, where it's heading at this point. This speech I'm referencing is the one that he gave to the first all-union Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934. And it's much different than a lot of the other speeches that were given in 1934. And so I'm kind of wondering, again, broadly, your best venture, what you think this is. Is this a statement on, kind of like we're saying, that he feels constrained within where the system is heading? Is it a statement on saying that creation is death? Is it an anti-creation sort of novel? Kind of, what do you think it is?
Yeah. What's the antinatalism?
And it can be multiple things.
He's opposed to babies here. The world's first antinatal smoker. I think in the moment, right? So it was written in 1927. In the moment, for my money or my perspective, it is this ambivalent, unresolvable tangle of knots where Olesha, who was, a very serious, or I don't know, very committed soccer fan and played soccer himself and appreciated the circus, this kind of physicality, he recognizes and appreciates, for instance, that aspect of the so-called new Soviet person, embodied in Volodya and Valya, who, are doing somersaults and all these gymnastics in this courtyard, in that one scene. As well, I think the kind of innovation and sort of brute energy that Andrei Babachev brings to communism. He respects the ability to get things done, basically. I think he recognizes and appreciates those things. At the same time, he loves individualist art. He appreciates seeing things from a skewed perspective. The critical metaphor for him, or perspective, I guess, is looking at the world through binoculars, but from the wrong end, right, where everything is reduced and you see small points, but you find detail, where the world isn't just the communist united perspective. I think in 1927, that's what the novel is, this attempt to kind of reason through it and rationalize his feelings, but it comes across and ultimately is really ambivalent. And then from there, going to this 1934 speech and beyond, he still has a lot of these feelings, but he's making these speeches where he says he's chosen not to be the beggar, chosen not to be the pauper, chosen not to be the man that he had described before in this kind of individualist, living out these new Soviet days, and that he wants to write and create art about the new Soviet youth, and that's where these new energies are and where we should all be focused. But a lot of that, I think, is, about survival, about, wanting to fit in and seeing more and more where things were headed, even in 1934. So to some extent, yeah, it's, about covering his tracks, covering what he had done before. And you can read, his memoirs. In English, it's available as No Day Without a Line. So he attempted to write every day at least a line. And there, a lot of these same themes and ideas come up, but also this appreciation for all the various authors, many of whom, wouldn't be championed in the Soviet Union. And these were memoirs written throughout these years where he wasn't publishing as much and focused more on screenwriting and reviews and translations, kind of other kinds of art.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is just interesting fact, I guess, that this phrase "engineers of the human soul" that is often attributed to Stalin is not really. It comes, from what I understand, originally from Olesha, which is, to me is. I think he's mocking this concept. I don't think he thinks you can engineer a human soul based on the fact that he then talks about how the world is beautiful only because it has grass and dawns and colors. It kind of makes me think, he's pointing obviously to the impossibility of engineering a human soul. And to me, the novel itself is really just a big inversion on kind of beauty as a whole. That was kind of one of the kind of key points for my takeaway. I was wondering kind of what you thought about the role of beauty very largely as well. In Envy, maybe if in Joyce,
in general.
In general,
What is beauty?
what is beauty?
Well, as Dostoevsky wrote, right? Beauty will save the world. I think we can start there. No, I think you're absolutely right. And this novel is absolutely a celebration of beauty, of strange perspectives, of recognizing the beautiful in the commonplace and the everyday. There's these various images. One, he's looking, Cavalier, I believe, is looking from a bridge and sees a boat moving across the water, and he compares it to an almond, a sliced almond or something. And he's just, the swirl of the world and the reflection of Babachev's button on his trousers, all these sorts of things that we take for granted. I think this is a perfect novel to explore and to study and to teach estrangement, defamiliarization, looking at things from a skewed perspective. It's brilliant for that, and for that reason, it's not Soviet art, right? These things aren't functional, right? The beauty of the reflection of a button or the shape, potentially the shape of a ship, its beauty. That's not going to build a new Soviet world. But Olesha, Kavalierov, they're championing these perspectives and beauty, and recognizing that in the world and seeing the inherent value of that this creative perspective. And I think in the same way, that's what Ulysses is all about, right? It's a day in the life of two men in particular, but many other characters. Molly Bloom, Leopold Bloom's wife, just going about their day, June 16th, 1904. There's nothing particularly special about it in any massive historical sense or anything like that. It's just another day in their lives, but their relationships, the things they see, are elevated in not exactly the same way as what Olesha is doing in Envy, but certainly in the play with language, the focus, just the very fact that they're focusing on these little things, or so-called little things, I think is crucial to the kind of literature and to the kind of perspective that these two writers had, which I just find so beautiful, let's say. so lovely to just appreciate those small things and think about new ways of describing them. So they do strike us as new instead of everyday and kind of rote.
There's a lot to cover in this book. I think we're coming towards the end of the time we have, but I do want to encourage for anyone, and I don't know if you have any last things you want to touch on, Jose, but I would hardly encourage everyone to read this book because it's not super long. I don't remember, like the copy I have is like 178 pages, but that also includes some other stuff. So it's a pretty quick read, and there's also just like a lot to, like there's so much stuff that I like notes I took that we didn't even have time to get to today of, like not even touching the whole Ophelia thing, which is so fascinating. Lot to get to, a lot of really interesting. So hardly encourage anyone listening to pick it up and definitely give it. It's like an afternoon read. Anything you wanted to, any last major thoughts you think would be really important for people to take away?
Maybe we can talk about Ophelia. I'd be curious to hear what you think since you brought it up.
Yeah. Well, okay. So Ophelia is fascinating to me because it really evoked, and I there's no way, I probably this wasn't related to it, but whenever we talk about like automatons, like, so Ophelia is supposed to be as Yvonne describes the machine, my machine could have made this era happy. It could do anything you wanted it to do, essentially. And it kind of like has this, I think of the golem a lot, because I feel like the golem, and at least from an American perspective, is like a very formative, like our character archetype for so many things, and that's what it seems to bring to mind for me. But the major difference here is, like, in traditional literature, the golem is made, at least prior to Frankenstein depictions of the golem, where that begins to take on like a horrifying life of its own. You see like the golem really being a very kind of almost human character. Like that's what really makes the golem so powerful. But here we have the reverse, where this machine was totally emotionless. It would have been fine. And then Yvonne says that he curses this machine by giving it human emotions. She can do anything, but right now she sings our ballads, the foolish ballads of the old era, and gathers the old era's flowers. She falls in love, gets jealous, cries, dreams. I did this. I mocked the divinity of these coming men. I mocked the machine. And I gave her the name of a girl who went out of her mind from love and despair. Ophelia, the most human and touching name of all. I thought that was so interesting that obviously I think underlying is Yvonne thinks that's a good thing to have those characteristics, but like to say the Soviet machine is totally is like brought to nothing by the characteristic of average human emotion is obviously Yvonne is not set up to be like a character who's right about a lot, but it does feel like a startlingly genuine kind of attempt, like attempt to throw a wrench at like the engineering of like the engineering of society, of like trying to create everything which is nice and neat and industrial.
Would you say of the engineering of the human soul?
I was trying to avoid saying that. I realized I was going there halfway through that sentence.
I think it was in all our heads there. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, another thing maybe to note here is that Olesha's father really wanted him to be an engineer. That was, the path he set him on, and he has this series of stories. He's a remarkable short story writer too. I'd recommend checking those out as well. They're in a collection in English that's available. So I think that's another factor to consider. Going back to Matt's point earlier and into this one about Ophelia itself. There's an engineering theme, this idea of creating a machine. For Olesha, who didn't want that, right? He didn't want to be an engineer. He wanted to create things with his mind, with his art, with his pen, rather than his hands or whatever it encompasses, whatever engineers use. I don't know. I'm not building stuff. Again, this tension there that speaks to this phrase of this concept of engineers of the human soul. That's very sinister, and I think even beyond the fact that Stalin adopted it and took it, the idea of engineering human souls is to me terrifying, right? This idea that you can craft people for purposes, which again maybe is not that irrelevant these days. I think there's maybe new forms of engineering of human souls going on, data-driven, etc. I don't know. I lost my train of thought here, but
totally fair.
With Ophelia, again, there's a kind of passion and respect for this creation, but cursing it and recognizing also the power of human emotions. Like you were saying, Cameron, I think is at play here. And giving it that name, Ophelia, right? This tragic figure from Hamlet, from Shakespeare, who's given, a kind of madness that breaks down what this machine is supposed to do. There's just so many layers to it, literary and biographical. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Ophelia is in the novel represented as basically an agent of destruction, of destroying the quarter, of coming to get Kavalerov, of wanting to quote unquote wanting to kill Yvonne, hating him, which is such an interesting, like the which entirely comes from the spring from like giving it a human sense of like this sense of humanity is also a destructive force in a sense of in its presence, which is interesting. I mean, going back to like Hamlet and Ophelia, like her character arc is self-destruction over something that's over. Well, I'm not going to get into an analysis of Hamlet right now because it's been too many years since I've actually read Hamlet, but yeah, it's like it's an interesting place of simultaneously feeling like this, like in all ways, its speech is meant genuinely of like almost like a critique of like in like you say, engineering of the human soul, while also this sort of humanity being fundamentally kind of a destructive force in the novel itself.
Yeah,
it brings into a lot of questions, just the anxieties that it has as a novel. It has it reminds me of this conversation a little bit of We by Zamyatin, and kind of as it's maybe responding a little bit to this, and also then the influence of Joyce, Shakespeare. This is all acting on this question of what is distinctly Soviet versus what is maybe more universal. And so these are really kind of interesting questions, and part of why I think I'll probably be rereading this again in the future.
I think the way you framed it there about anxieties is perfect, right? I hadn't necessarily thought about it in that term anyway. It's this.
I don't want to say anxieties of influence because that's not my term, but
No, yeah,
Perhaps.
but sort of reducing it, or I mean that in a positive way, reducing it to this kind of bundle of anxieties. It's a very anxious novel in every regard, and
it is
for only 150 whatever pages. It's deeply uncomfortable for itself and for the reader. But you should read it.
You should read it.
Not that you should not. Yeah.
Do you have anxiety? Maybe you should read this book.
This will make it worse.
Yeah.
But I mean, isn't that kind of Russian literature as a whole?
Well,
good deal.
yeah.
Yeah, good. I mean, we read some happy books.
I don't think we did.
Vasilisa Maligina is kind of happy.
Don't think it is.
It ends on a happier note. Actually, interesting. I feel like Colin Tye's work is the only one which is like kind of at the end fun, like unambiguous in where it stands, because like a lot of other works are like cement, envy. A lot of other works from Sarah kind of like do, at least when I'm looking at it, has the sense of like ambivalence towards it, whereas Vasilis or like Colin Tye's is like, yeah, I mean the people are shitty, but the system's great. I mean this is what we got to be the ones building it, which is kind of funny to me.
Yeah. The 20s be like that. Really. 20s are the best period of Soviet literature, I think. It's pretty good.
Yeah. You get, in the 30s you get more with the Obryu, Harms, and Yudiensky and so on. Yeah. I mean, it depends on what you mean by Soviet here, but
yeah.
I don't know. I don't discount the 30s.
Let's
sell them short.
All right. Jose, you have a couple of other really interesting projects that you were you have a lot of projects that you're working on, but you have a couple that you're going to talk about. And I wanted to hear kind of some of the other stuff that you're working on, maybe some of the things that you have done that maybe some of our listeners may be interested in exploring more. Because like I said, you've done a lot of really interesting stuff. So please.
Plug away. Okay.
Plug away.
I can just mention the next big project that I'm working on is I'm really shifting gears from Joyce and Russian literature to contemporary Russian prison literature. So looking essentially at the last 30 years of prison writing, not only memoirs in the kind of Solzhenitsyn, Dostoevsky style prison writing, but fictional works, historical novels that look back at the Soviet era, for instance, as well as poetry, other things. Just basically what the concept of incarceration has done and has become in Russian literature in these last few decades. What it means today. So that's in the works, along with the project on Chernobyl. I became fascinated with Chernobyl a few years ago, before the HBO series, I have to always mention. And I taught a course on Chernobyl. The HBO series helped, certainly, with enrollments there. But I'm particularly fascinated with representations of and responses to Chernobyl, transnational, international, generic, etc. How it's been represented in different media, and why. So I'm working on that. One thing that I think coming out this year, apparently, despite what I was told, there was a shortage of copy editors. I don't know if you've heard about this very tragic situation, but there's a shortage of copy editors right now, along with many other things. But it seems like a book I am co-editing, or have co-edited, I guess, with a colleague, a friend, Sarah Karpuchin, on the new approaches to Nabokov, will be coming out this year. It's called Reimagining Nabokov, Pedagogies for the 21st Century, through Amherst College Press. I would also make a pitch or a plug for Amherst College Press, which I think is an amazing press, and they have a great model. It's open access, digital native, whatever the term is, so it's available right away online. Just really humane and progressive model, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I think both for readers and for...
Are you sure that's better than the model where everybody has to pay $150 per book and then the author gets 3 cents? Are you sure that's working, man?
Well, I don't know. I might reconsider. You're right.
I know when I put it like that.
Yeah. The hard sell. Yeah, so hopefully that'll be out later this year, at least the physical, or sorry, the digital version. And finally, I'll just mention, and this is something anyone could participate in if they're so I don't know, intrigued, so motivated. I'm co-producing, I suppose, with another colleague, Martina Napolitano, a digital edition of Sasha Sokoloff's second novel, Between Dog and Wolf, Mieszu Sobaka I Volkom. I don't know how familiar with that novel you two are, but it's been called the Russian Finnegan's Wake, which is not fair, it's not accurate, but it's a bizarre, very strange, very complicated novel that deserves, full annotation. So we got the permissions. It's all online.
That's really cool.
We're working on it right now, adding to it. If anyone wants to, be a contributor, we're open to that. It's both the original Russian and the English translation was finally translated a few years ago. It's more work than I anticipated, I will say.
Sure.
But we're very excited about it and eager, to share it with people eventually.
Yeah.
Sure.
For any of the stuff that has links already online, there will be links to all this in the show notes. Yeah. And I'm so excited for the literature of incarceration, because I'm actually trying to do some research in tangential areas. So I'm super excited for that coming out, because that sounds really awesome.
I want to hear about that. Yeah.
Yeah. But
I think we're about as wrapped up as we can be in our hour-ish long, 10-minute show format. But thank you again for coming on. We had a great time, good discussion. Be happy to have you back when any of the books are out, for sure.
Yes. And before we go, though, we do have to ask, because both Jose and Matt have had to watch me grossly drink a lot of beers this whole time. On a scale of 1 to Yeltsin, where are you both?
That's quite a range. I would probably say just like a 5, something.
It's a 5.
Reasonable. I don't know. There's still nighttime left.
Yeah.
How about you, Matt?
I'm around you at 4 or 5, because I only had 1 cup and I foolishly forgot to bring my supplies with me. But how did you fare, Cameron?
I'm 3 beers in, so I'm probably only a 4 to 5. However, I am feeling a lot warmer after that. I was kind of hoping they'd cool me down. I don't know why.
Has that ever happened?
I shouldn't be this stupid at this point in my life, but yeah, exactly. But it was nice. Nice. Well, the beers were cold. I had them up here so I don't have to leave my desk, so they're a little warm now, so it's not quite as refreshing. But anyway, yeah, definitely around the same as where the two of you are. I had to keep my back in my head, this is one of the ones where I have to be a little bit more sober to talk about it. There's some novels, I'm not gonna point out which ones are, you can definitely be pretty drunk and still talk about them. This one requires some nuance of mind.
Very fair, very responsible.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
And as much as we hate to leave behind this topic, Matt, we've got to go to something far sadder. So why don't we introduce what we're going to be starting? Not just the episode next week, but a whole new series. Not next week. On our next episode. What are we getting into next time, Matt?
That's right. It is all downhill from here in terms of being depressed. Next episode, we're going to be starting our 10-parter on Vasily Grossman's Stalingrad. So I guess join us. It'd be good. It was a fun episode to record, because this is Matt from the future, just to let you know. We already recorded it.
It's weird because it's Stalingrad, as you might imagine, being about the siege of Stalingrad, intensely sad book, but also Grossman is such a wonderful writer, and the Chancellors did such a good job with their translation that it's mesmerizing, but also heartbreaking at the same time.
It is.
So it's a real mix of emotions.
It is, but it's going to be a good series, and we're going to be going back to 3 times a month now that we've hit our patron goal, which is pretty incredible. So you won't have to sit through 8 months of Stalingrad. So that's good.
It's good timing.
Probably.
I'm glad that we didn't intend it to be this way, but I like that we had Stalingrad as a threat hanging over that. The goal for getting an editor. Completely unintentional, but
was it?
Maybe it wasn't. Dun dun dun.
Well, speaking of patrons, we got a whole bunch of you. supporting us, which is just so nice, so nice. We got Jeff, Madeline, and Janice, Daniel, Darren, Daniel, Jack, Paige, Jesse, Lou, Larkin, Irini, Brandon, Allison, Cole, Elise, Mysterious Donor Dude, Joanne, Yitza, Alex, Stephanie, Julie, Eli, Caitlin, Brett, Isaac, Austin, Zachary, Pack Rob, and Maya. That's right. We got a nice thick number of patrons now. It's good stuff. Because podcasting isn't free and grad school doesn't pay very well, and we wanted to get an editor because it's so much work editing the podcast, but it is so much fun. So we're so happy to be able to to start doing it 3 times a month. Maybe, just maybe, one day we go back to weekly, but it's gonna be a hoof,
We'll see.
Anyways, my pitch to you is if you're interested in joining with our current patrons to help keep the show running, take a look at our Patreon at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy.
The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you're looking for other places to find us, you can also follow us on Instagram at Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast or join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
You'll hear from us again soon.